Hello, welcome to the world of stories. Here, each video is a journey full of emotion, mystery, and unforgettable adventures. Thank you for clicking to watch and embarking with us on another captivating narrative. If you like stories that hold your attention and touch the heart, don't forget to like.
The relentless drizzle blanketed the streets of Manhattan, a gray curtain turning the vibrant city into a blur of reflections and shadows. Inside a small, dimly lit cafe tucked away on 7th Avenue, a young woman sat at the piano near the corner window. Grace Harper, a wiry figure with auburn hair falling in messy waves to her shoulders, played a soft, melancholic tune of her own composition. Her fingers danced across the keys with a confidence that belied the hollow ache in her chest. This wasn't just music. It was her way of speaking to a world that had rarely listened. A handful of patrons sat scattered throughout the cafe, nursing lattes and tapping on laptops. No one seemed to notice the intensity in Grace's playing. That was until the cafe door swung open, bringing with it a gust of cold wind and two sharply dressed figures, Eleanor Whitmore and her husband Charles. Their presence was commanding, even in the casual intimacy of the cafe. Eleanor, a statuesque woman with a poised demeanor, glanced around, visibly displeased by the cafe's quaintness. Charles, more relaxed, muttered something reassuring to her. As the couple settled at a table, Eleanor's attention was drawn to the music. The piece shifted into a crescendo, filling the air with emotions that Grace could not put into words. The melody seemed to hold pain, hope, and an ethereal yearning that resonated deeply. Eleanor found herself captivated, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a crack in the armor she had built around her heart. When the song ended, polite applause broke out. Grace smiled faintly and stood to collect tips from the piano's small jar. She counted the crumpled bills. $8. Her shoulders sagged. That wouldn't even cover half of her overdue utility bill, let alone rent. "Excuse me," a voice cut through her thoughts. Grace turned to see Eleanor Whitmore, her elegant figure silhouetted against the warm cafe lighting. That was a remarkable performance. What piece was it? Grace hesitated. "It's mine. I composed it." She avoided Eleanor's penetrating gaze, which felt like it could unearth secrets Grace wasn't ready to share. Charles stepped closer, his warm smile easing some of the tension. "It's not every day you hear music like that in a small cafe." "Thank you," Grace mumbled, clutching her tip jar protectively. "What's your name?" Eleanor asked. "Grace Harper. Do you play professionally?" Grace shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Not exactly. I'm just trying to get by." The conversation might have ended there if not for the flicker of desperation Eleanor saw in Grace's eyes. It was a look she recognized, a look she had seen in herself once, long ago. An hour later, the cafe had emptied, and the rain outside had turned into a downpour. Grace was gathering her things when Eleanor approached her again, this time more hesitantly. "Grace, forgive me if this sounds forward, but do you have a place to stay tonight?" Grace froze. She didn't want to admit the truth. For weeks, she'd been living on borrowed time in a tiny apartment with no heat, and her landlord had given her a final eviction notice that morning. "I'll manage," she said curtly. Charles appeared beside his wife, his kind expression unwavering. "We have more space than we need in our home. Why don't you stay with us for a while, just until you're back on your feet?" Grace stared at them, unsure whether to laugh or run. "I don't know you," she blurted out. "And you don't know me. Why would you do that?" Eleanor folded her arms, her gaze steady. "Because I see potential in you. I see someone worth helping." It wasn't the promise of comfort that swayed Grace. It was the vulnerability in Eleanor's voice, the suggestion that this wasn't just charity, but something deeper. Against her better judgment, she agreed. That night, Grace followed the Whitmores in a sleek black car to their estate in the Hamptons. As they passed through wrought iron gates, Grace's breath caught. The mansion was a sprawling, modern masterpiece, all glass and marble, surrounded by manicured gardens. Inside, the house was equally stunning, but it felt cold, almost like a museum. A grand staircase dominated the foyer, and priceless art adorned the walls. It was a world Grace had only seen in movies. A teenage girl bounded down the stairs, her energy a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere. Sophia Whitmore, 15 and effervescent, introduced herself with an infectious grin. "Are you the new charity case?" she asked bluntly, earning a sharp look from Eleanor. Sophia shrugged. "What? I'm just curious." Grace didn't know how to respond. Eleanor showed Grace to a guest room on the second floor, a space larger than her entire apartment. "You can stay here as long as you like," Eleanor said, her voice softer than before. Grace hesitated. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing. Rest now. We'll talk more in the morning." Left alone, Grace lay on the plush bed, staring at the ornate ceiling. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into a fairy tale. But fairy tales often had a dark side. Unable to sleep, Grace wandered the mansion until she stumbled upon a room filled with musical instruments. At the center was a grand piano, more beautiful than any she had ever seen. Without thinking, she sat down and began to play. The music filled the house, drawing the attention of Eleanor, who watched silently from the doorway. There was something hauntingly familiar in the way Grace played, something that tugged at memories Eleanor had buried. As the final notes faded, Grace looked up to find Eleanor watching her. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. Eleanor hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Maybe you remind me of someone I once knew." Grace didn't press further, but the weight of those words lingered. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't entirely alone. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would change all of their lives forever. Grace woke up to sunlight streaming through sheer, floor-to-ceiling curtains. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was. The bed was impossibly soft, the sheets cool against her skin, and the faint sound of birds chirping outside added a surreal calm. Then reality hit her like a cold wave. She was in the Whitmore mansion, a world so far removed from the tiny, crumbling apartment she had called home just yesterday that it almost felt like a dream. She sat up and looked around. The room was pristine, decorated in soft, muted tones of cream and gold, with elegant furniture that seemed too delicate to touch. On the bedside table was a small tray holding a glass of water and a handwritten note in elegant cursive. "Good morning. Breakfast is at 8. Take your time getting settled. Eleanor Whitmore." Grace frowned at the note. There was something clinical about it, as if Eleanor had written it more out of obligation than genuine care. Still, the gesture was appreciated. Grace got up, washed her face in the attached marble bathroom that was larger than her old living room, and dressed in the only pair of clean jeans and a sweater she had left in her bag. She felt hopelessly out of place in this palace, but there was no turning back now. Downstairs, the house was eerily quiet. Grace followed the scent of coffee to a dining room that looked more like a ballroom, with a long table set for 6, though only 3 places were prepared. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, sipping tea and reading the newspaper. Charles, who seemed more approachable in his rumpled cardigan, gave Grace a warm smile as she entered. "Good morning, Grace," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. Eleanor looked up briefly and nodded in acknowledgement before returning her attention to the paper. The tension in the room was palpable, and Grace shifted uncomfortably. "Did you sleep well?" Charles asked, his voice gentle but deliberate, as though trying to fill the silence. "Yes, thank you," Grace replied, glancing at Eleanor, who didn't look up again. Breakfast was an elaborate affair, far more than Grace was used to. There were fresh pastries, fruit platters, and even a chef who appeared briefly to ask if Grace had any dietary preferences. She felt out of place, but hunger won out, and she helped herself to a croissant and some orange juice. As they ate, Charles made small talk about the weather and the news, while Eleanor remained distant, occasionally glancing at Grace with an expression she couldn't quite read. Grace's nerves were frayed by the time the meal ended. She was about to excuse herself when a whirlwind of energy burst into the room. Sophia Whitmore, dressed in a bright pink tracksuit and clutching her phone, plopped down in a chair across from Grace. "You're still here," Sophia said, her tone somewhere between curiosity and challenge. Grace didn't know how to respond. "Sophia," Charles warned gently, but she ignored him. "So, what's your deal? Are you, like, an artist or something? My mom only drags people in if they're talented." Sophia's words stung more than Grace cared to admit, though they were partially true. "Sophia," Eleanor said sharply, finally looking up from her paper. "What?" Sophia shrugged. "It's a fair question." Grace swallowed her frustration and forced a polite smile. "I play piano." "Cool," Sophia said, clearly unimpressed. "Well, good luck. Mom's a perfectionist. If you mess up, she'll probably kick you out." "Sophia, enough," Eleanor snapped, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. Sophia rolled her eyes and slouched back in her chair, muttering something under her breath. Grace felt like she was caught in the middle of a battle she didn't understand. After breakfast, Eleanor suggested a tour of the estate, but the suggestion came more as an order. Grace followed her through the sprawling mansion, marveling at the opulence of every room. There were entire wings dedicated to art, music, and even rare books. Eleanor's tone as she described each space was measured, almost rehearsed, as though she had given this tour many times before. "This is the music room," Eleanor said, opening the door to a vast space with polished wood floors and walls lined with instruments. In the center stood the grand piano Grace had played the night before. Grace's fingers itched to touch the keys again, but she hesitated, unsure of whether she was allowed. Eleanor seemed to notice and nodded. "Go ahead." Grace sat at the piano and let her fingers drift over the keys, playing a simple melody she had composed years ago. Eleanor watched silently, her expression unreadable. When Grace finished, Eleanor nodded approvingly. "You have talent," she said, "but talent alone isn't enough. Discipline and determination are what separate the great from the mediocre." The word stung, but Grace nodded, unwilling to show weakness. "I'll arrange for you to start lessons with a professional tutor," Eleanor continued. "There's a competition coming up in a few months. If you're going to live here, you might as well aim for something meaningful." Grace didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to reject the offer outright, to prove that she wasn't just another project for Eleanor to mold. But another part of her, the part that dreamed of making something of herself, couldn't ignore the opportunity. "Thank you," she said quietly, though the words felt heavy in her mouth. Eleanor nodded, satisfied, and left the room, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts. Later that day, Grace wandered the grounds of the estate, trying to clear her head. The gardens were immaculate, with perfectly trimmed hedges and colorful flowers arranged in patterns that looked almost too perfect to be real. She found a bench near a small pond and sat down, letting the quiet wash over her. She was startled when a shadow fell across her. Looking up, she saw Liam Whitmore, Eleanor, and Charles's eldest son. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with tousled dark hair and a sharp jawline that seemed to carry a permanent smirk. "You must be the new house guest," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Grace bristled at his attitude, but forced herself to remain calm. "I guess I am." Liam chuckled and sat down on the bench beside her, though he kept a deliberate distance. "Don't take it personally. My mom has a habit of collecting strays." "I'm not a stray," Grace said, her voice colder than she intended. Liam raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Touchy, aren't we?" Grace clenched her fists, determined not to let him get under her skin. "If you don't have anything nice to say, maybe don't say anything at all." Liam laughed, a low, rich sound that only irritated her further. "Relax, I'm just messing with you. You're not the first person my mom's brought into this house. Most of them don't last long." "Well, I'm not most people," Grace shot back, surprising even herself with the confidence in her voice. Liam studied her for a moment, his smirk fading. "No, I don't think you are," he said, almost to himself. Then he stood and stretched, flashing her a roguish grin. "Good luck, Grace. You'll need it." As he walked away, Grace felt a mix of frustration and curiosity. There was something about Liam that intrigued her, even though she knew better than to trust him. That night, as she lay in bed, Grace replayed the events of the day in her mind. The Whitmore family was more complicated than she had expected. Eleanor was a mix of kindness and strictness. Charles seemed kind but distant. Sophia was a whirlwind of bluntness, and Liam was a mystery she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. Grace stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. She had been given a chance to change her life, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it came with strings attached. For better or worse, she was now part of this world, and there was no turning back. The days in the Whitmore mansion settled into an uneasy rhythm. Grace found herself in a peculiar limbo, neither fully a part of the family nor completely an outsider. Eleanor remained distant, her polite but reserved demeanor always leaving Grace wondering if she was being judged. Charles was kind but often absent, buried in work or slipping away for business trips. Sophia, for all her brashness, had an odd way of growing on Grace. She was unfiltered and curious, often barging into Grace's room to pepper her with questions about her life or to complain about her parents. Liam, on the other hand, continued to be an enigma. He appeared sporadically, always with a smirk or a cryptic comment that left Grace feeling more off balance than before. The one constant in Grace's life was a piano. Every day, she would retreat to the music room, pouring her emotions into the keys. It became her sanctuary, the one place in the mansion where she felt entirely herself. Eleanor had kept her word about arranging lessons, and within a week, Grace was introduced to a stern but brilliant piano tutor named Margaret Winters. Margaret was a renowned musician whose reputation for excellence was matched only by her unrelenting discipline. "You have raw talent," Margaret told Grace during their first session, her sharp eyes boring into her. "But talent means nothing without precision and dedication. We will work on both." The lessons were grueling, lasting for hours and pushing Grace to the edge of her endurance. But she didn't complain. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose, a glimpse of the future she had always dreamed of but never dared to believe could be hers. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting session, Grace lingered in the music room, letting her fingers drift across the keys in an improvised melody. She was so lost in the music that she didn't notice Liam standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat. "You really love this, don't you?" he said, stepping into the room. Grace jumped, her fingers stumbling over the keys. "Do you always sneak up on people?" Liam grinned, unrepentant. "Only when they're playing something worth listening to." Grace rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. "What do you want, Liam?" He leaned casually against the piano, his dark eyes studying her. "Just curious. You've been here for a couple of weeks now, and you're different." "Different how?" Liam shrugged. "Most people who come into this house act like they're walking on eggshells. But you stand your ground. I like that." Grace felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. She quickly looked away, focusing on the piano. "I'm just trying to survive, same as anyone else." "Sure," Liam said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "But surviving and living are two different things. You should remember that." Before she could respond, he straightened and left the room, leaving Grace with more questions than answers. That night, as Grace lay in bed, her thoughts kept drifting back to Liam's words. He had a way of getting under her skin, challenging her in ways that both irritated and intrigued her. But there was something else, too, something about the way he looked at her that made her heart race in a way she wasn't ready to admit. The following morning, Grace was woken by a knock on her door. She opened it to find Sophia standing there, her arms crossed and a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Get dressed," Sophia said. "We're going on an adventure." "What kind of adventure?" Grace asked, wary. "You'll see. Just trust me. Against her better judgment, Grace followed Sophia outside to the stables. Grace hadn't even known the Whitmores' own horses, but there they were, magnificent animals grazing in a lush paddock. Sophia led Grace to a sleek black horse named Midnight and handed her the reins. "Do you know how to ride?" Sophia asked. Grace shook her head. "Good," Sophia said with a grin. "You'll learn." The lesson was chaotic, to say the least. Grace clung to the saddle for dear life as Midnight trotted around the paddock, while Sophia shouted instructions from the sidelines. Despite the initial terror, Grace eventually found her rhythm, and by the end of the afternoon, she was laughing as Midnight carried her across the field. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, Grace felt a sense of belonging, but the feeling was short-lived. That evening, as Grace returned to the house, she overheard Eleanor and Charles arguing in the study. Their voices were muffled, but the tension was unmistakable. Grace paused outside the door, unsure whether to leave or announce her presence. "She deserves to know the truth," Charles was saying. "And ruin everything we've worked for?" Eleanor snapped. "No, not yet." Grace's heart pounded. Were they talking about her? What truth? Unable to bear the uncertainty, Grace hurried away, her mind racing with possibilities. Over the next few days, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was being kept from her. The mansion, for all its beauty, began to feel like a labyrinth of secrets. She noticed small things she hadn't paid attention to before. A locked drawer in Eleanor's office, whispers that stopped when she entered a room, and the way Eleanor's expression would harden whenever Grace brought up her past. One evening, unable to sleep, Grace decided to explore the house. She wandered through the dark hallways, her footsteps echoing against the marble floors. Eventually, she found herself in Eleanor's office. The door was ajar, and the faint glow of moonlight illuminated the room. Grace hesitated. She knew she shouldn't be there, but curiosity got the better of her. She stepped inside and approached the desk, her eyes drawn to the locked drawer. It was slightly open, as if someone had forgotten to secure it. Inside, Grace found a stack of old photographs. She picked up the first one and froze. It was a picture of a young girl who looked eerily like Grace. The resemblance was uncanny. The same auburn hair, the same sharp cheekbones. The girl was standing between Eleanor and Charles, her face lit with a bright, carefree smile. Grace's hands trembled as she stared at the photo. Who was this girl? And why did she look so much like her? Before she could process what she was seeing, she heard footsteps approaching. Panic set in, and she quickly returned the photo to the drawer, closing it as quietly as she could. The door opened and Eleanor stepped inside. "What are you doing in here?" Eleanor asked, her voice cold and sharp. Grace stammered, searching for an excuse. I couldn't sleep. I was just exploring." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Grace thought she was going to press the issue. But then Eleanor sighed and said, "You should go back to bed." Grace nodded and hurried out of the room, her heart pounding. That night, as she lay awake, the question swirled in her mind. The girl in the photo, the argument she had overheard, the secrets Eleanor seemed so determined to keep. All of it pointed to something bigger than Grace had ever imagined. And she was determined to find out the truth. The days following Grace's discovery were a blur of unease. She couldn't stop thinking about the photograph in Eleanor's office. The girl who looked so much like her, standing between Eleanor and Charles with a smile, so bright it was almost mocking in its similarity to her own. Questions swirled relentlessly. Who was she? Why hadn't Eleanor or Charles mentioned her? And, more unsettling, was Grace here because of that resemblance? Grace began to scrutinize every interaction, every sidelong glance from Eleanor, every word left unsaid. She longed to ask outright, but the memory of Eleanor's cold reaction in the office held her back. Instead, she threw herself into her piano practice, trying to lose herself in the notes and melodies. But even the music felt different now, as though it carried the weight of secrets she couldn't name. Margaret Winters, her stern piano tutor, noticed the shift almost immediately. "Your timing is off," Margaret barked one afternoon, slamming her hand against the edge of the piano. "Are you even paying attention?" "I'm sorry," Grace muttered, shaking her head as if that would dispel the fog in her mind. Margaret's sharp eyes softened ever so slightly, a rare flicker of empathy crossing her face. "Whatever's going on, leave it outside this room. Music requires focus and honesty. If your heart's not in it, the audience will know." Grace nodded, though her thoughts were still tangled. After the lesson, Grace lingered in the music room, letting her fingers trail over the keys without purpose. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of activity from the staff. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't hear Liam enter until he spoke. "Margaret, giving you a hard time again." Grace jumped, her hands flying off the keys. "Do you always sneak up on people?" Liam smirked and leaned against the piano, his usual air of casual confidence firmly in place. "Only when they look like they're about to set the piano on fire with frustration." Grace sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I just can't focus. There's too much going on." "Ah," Liam said, his tone shifting slightly. "Let me guess. You're starting to realize this house isn't as perfect as it looks." Grace shot him a sharp look, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean by that?" Liam shrugged, but his smirk faltered, replaced by something heavier. "Let's just say the Whitmores are good at keeping up appearances. But appearances don't tell the whole story." Grace wanted to press him, to ask what he knew, but he straightened before she could speak, the mask of nonchalance sliding back into place. "Anyway," Liam said, his tone light again, "if you need a break from all the piano drills, let me know. I know a few places around here where you can breathe." With that, he left, leaving Grace even more unsettled than before. That night, as Grace lay in bed, she resolved to find answers. She couldn't keep living in this limbo of uncertainty, surrounded by whispers and shadows. If the Whitmores weren't going to tell her the truth, she would have to uncover it herself. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. A week later, during one of Charles's rare evenings at home, the family gathered for dinner. The dining room was its usual picture of elegance, the table adorned with crystal glasses and fine china. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her posture as rigid as ever, while Charles tried to engage everyone in light conversation. "I hear Margaret's been working you hard," Charles said, directing the comment to Grace. "How's it going?" "She's intense," Grace admitted, earning a chuckle from Charles and a rare smile from Sophia. "She was my teacher too," Eleanor interjected, her tone clipped. "Her methods are demanding, but they produce results. If you want to succeed, you'll have to rise to her expectations." Grace nodded, though Eleanor's words felt like more of a command than encouragement. The conversation turned to Charles's latest business ventures, and Grace used a moment to observe the family. Sophia picked at her food, clearly bored, while Eleanor's eyes flicked to Grace every so often, her expression unreadable. Liam, seated across from Grace, caught her gaze and raised an eyebrow, as if to say, "Told you so." After dinner, Grace decided to take a walk around the grounds. The night was cool, and the gardens were bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows that made the estate feel even more imposing. She wandered aimlessly, her mind racing with everything she had observed and overheard in the weeks since her arrival. As she rounded a corner near the stables, she heard voices. Curious, she crept closer, keeping to the shadows. "Do you really think it's a good idea to keep her here?" It was Charles's voice, low and tense. "She belongs here," Eleanor replied, her tone sharp. "This is the only way." "You don't know that," Charles argued. "We're gambling with her life." "It's not a gamble," Eleanor snapped. "It's a chance to make things right." Grace's stomach twisted. She pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear more, but the conversation ended abruptly. Moments later, Eleanor and Charles emerged from the stables, their faces drawn and tense. Grace ducked out of sight, her heart pounding. The next morning, Grace decided to confront Sophia. The younger girl was lounging by the pool, scrolling through her phone and sipping on a brightly colored drink. "Sophia," Grace began, her voice steady despite the nerves coiling in her stomach. "Can I ask you something?" Sophia glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Sure, as long as it's not about algebra." Grace hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Who's the girl in the photograph? The one with your parents?" Sophia froze, her playful demeanor vanishing. "What are you talking about?" "I saw a picture in your mom's office," Grace said carefully. "There was a girl in it who looked like me." Sophia's expression hardened. "You shouldn't have been snooping around." "I wasn't snooping," Grace protested. "It was an accident. But I need to know, who was she?" For a moment, Sophia looked torn, as though she was debating whether to speak. Finally, she sighed and put down her drink. "Her name was Emily," Sophia said quietly. "She was my sister." Grace's breath caught. "Your sister?" Sophia nodded, her eyes distant. "She died when I was little. I don't remember much about her, but Mom and Dad, they don't like to talk about her. It's like she's some big secret or something." The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The girl in the photograph wasn't just any stranger. She was Emily Whitmore, Eleanor and Charles's daughter. And Grace was beginning to understand why Eleanor had brought her here. Grace spent the rest of the day in a daze, the revelation consuming her thoughts. The resemblance between her and Emily was undeniable, and it explained so much. Eleanor's fixation on her, Charles's hesitation, and even Liam's cryptic remarks. That night, Grace sat at the piano, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the keys. The music room, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. She played a few hesitant notes, but the melody faltered, unable to rise above the storm of emotions inside her. Liam appeared in the doorway, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "You found out, didn't you?" he said, his voice low. Grace looked up at him, her eyes filled with questions. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Liam sighed and stepped into the room, sitting beside her on the bench. "Because that's how this family works. We hide things. We bury them until they start to rot." "Emily," Grace said, the name tasting foreign on her tongue. "I look like her, don't I?" Liam nodded, his jaw tight. Too much like her. Grace felt a chill run through her. "Why am I here, Liam? Is it because of hers?" Liam didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out and gently took her hand, his touch grounding her in the midst of her turmoil. "You're here because my mother thinks she can rewrite the past," he said finally. "But you're not Emily, Grace. Don't let her turn you into something you're not." His words were both a warning and a comfort. And as Grace stared into his eyes, she realized she was standing on the edge of something far bigger than herself. The days stretched on, each one heavier than the last, as Grace grappled with the revelation of Emily Whitmore. The weight of it clung to her, changing the way she saw the mansion and the people within it. Every glance from Eleanor now felt laden with expectation. Every word spoken by Charles carried an undercurrent of regret. And every moment alone with Liam brought 1,000 unanswered questions to the surface. The resemblance between her and Emily was undeniable. It wasn't just the physical similarities. It was the way Eleanor sometimes looked at her, as though she were staring at a ghost. Grace wanted to confront her, to demand the truth outright. But every time she tried to summon the courage, the words got stuck in her throat. Instead, she began to notice things she hadn't before. Subtle, quiet clues left behind by Emily's memory. A room down the hall from hers that was always locked. The way Eleanor would stiffen at the sound of piano music drifting through the house. And then there were the photographs, too many to count. Tucked away in corners and hallways, all of them missing one key person. Emily's absence was as loud as a scream. One evening, as Grace wandered the house in search of distraction, she found herself drawn to the locked room. She stood before the door, her hand hovering over the knob. It felt wrong to intrude, but her curiosity was relentless. A noise behind her made her spin around. Liam stood at the end of the hall, his arms crossed. "Let me guess," he said, his voice low. "You want to know what's in there?" Grace nodded, her heart pounding. Liam sighed and walked toward her, pulling a key from his pocket. "You're not the first to ask, but you might be the first person who deserves to see it." He unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her in. The room was a time capsule. It was smaller than Grace had expected, cozy but filled with a sense of life long since departed. A canopied bed with soft lavender bedding, bookshelves crammed with novels and trinkets, and a desk littered with old notebooks and pens. On the far wall was a large bulletin board pinned with photographs, ticket stubs, and handwritten notes. Grace stepped inside, her chest tight as she took it all in. It felt like trespassing, but it also felt like stepping into a story that had been waiting for her to read it. "That was Emily's room," Liam said from the doorway, his voice quieter now. Grace turned to him, the question clear in her eyes. "She died when I was 13, he continued. "Car accident. It happened while we were coming back from one of my soccer games. She loved cheering me on." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he seemed lost in the memory. "I was fine. A few scratches. But Emily..." Grace's stomach churned as she tried to imagine what that must have been like. "She was everything to my mom," Liam went on, his voice thick. "Emily was perfect, talented, kind, always knew how to make people smile. When she died, it destroyed my mom. She tried to keep it together for the rest of us, but she hasn't been the same since." Grace glanced around the room again, the sadness of it pressing down on her. "Why does she look at me like that? Why did she bring me here?" Liam hesitated, his expression conflicted. "Because you remind her of Emily. It's not just how you look. It's the way you play piano, the way you carry yourself. She sees something in you that she thinks she lost." The words hit Grace like a blow. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. "I'm not Emily," she whispered. "I know," Liam said, stepping closer. "But my mom, she's not good at letting go. She wants to believe you being here is some kind of second chance." Grace looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "That's not fair. To me, or to her." "No, it's not," Liam agreed. "But it's the way she copes." The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of things neither of them could fully say. Over the next few days, Grace tried to distance herself from Eleanor, avoiding prolonged conversations and spending more time in the music room or outside with Sophia. But Eleanor was never far, her presence lingering like a shadow. One evening, after dinner, Eleanor surprised Grace by asking her to join her in the sitting room. It was an unusual request. Eleanor rarely sought out company unless it was for formalities. Grace followed her reluctantly, sitting on the edge of an ornate armchair as Eleanor poured them both cups of tea. "I imagine Liam has told you about Emily," Eleanor said after a long silence. Grace nodded, unsure of how to respond. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "She was everything to me. My firstborn, my light. Losing her." She trailed off, her composure faltering for the first time since Grace had met her. "I'm sorry," Grace said softly, the words feeling inadequate. Eleanor looked at her, her eyes sharp despite the emotion in them. "Do you know why I brought you here?" Grace hesitated, then shook her head. "At first, I thought it was coincidence," Eleanor said. "When I heard you play in that cafe, I was drawn to you not just because of your talent, but because you reminded me of her. I thought perhaps it was fate, a way to fill the void she left behind. But now I realize it's not that simple." Grace's heart pounded. "Then why am I here?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. "Because you deserve a chance. The world hasn't been kind to you, Grace, and I can help you if you let me. But I won't lie. It's selfish of me. You do remind me of Emily, And maybe that's part of why I'm doing this. But I see you for who you are. 2. You're not her, and I don't want you to be. I just want to help." The raw honesty in Eleanor's words caught Grace off guard. She didn't know how to respond, her emotions warring between gratitude and resentment. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to stay, Grace. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But if you stay, I promise to do everything I can to help you achieve what you're capable of. Not for Emily, for you." Grace stared at her, trying to make sense of the offer. For weeks, she had felt like a pawn in some larger game, a stand-in for a daughter lost too soon. But now, looking into Eleanor's eyes, she saw something she hadn't before: sincerity. "I'll think about it," Grace said finally. Eleanor nodded, seeming to accept that. That night, as Grace lay in bed, she thought about everything Eleanor had said. She didn't know if she could trust her entirely, but part of her didn't want to leave. Despite the pain and confusion, this house, this family, had begun to feel like something she had been searching for all her life. But she couldn't shake the feeling that staying would come at a cost. The Whitmore estate was unusually quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by a heavy stillness that reflected the unease in Grace's heart. The conversation with Eleanor had shaken her, forcing her to confront not just the reason she had stayed, but also the reason she had hesitated. The offer Eleanor had made, a promise of support and opportunity, was tempting, but Grace couldn't help but wonder what it would cost her to accept. The tension in the house reached a breaking point a few days later during a rare family dinner. Eleanor, Charles, Liam, Sophia, and Grace all sat around the grand dining table, the clinking of silverware the only sound breaking the silence. "So, Grace," Eleanor began, her tone carefully measured, "have you thought about what we discussed?" All eyes turned to Grace. She felt the weight of their gazes, especially Liam's, whose expression was unreadable. "I have," Grace said slowly. She set down her fork and met Eleanor's gaze directly. "And I need to say something." Eleanor's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly, and Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm grateful for everything you've done for me," Grace continued, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "But I need to make one thing clear. I'm not Emily. I'll never be Emily. And if that's why I'm here, if you're trying to bring her back through me, then this isn't going to work." The words hung in the air, a challenge and a plea all at once. Eleanor's face softened, and for the first time, Grace saw not the poised, unflappable matriarch, but a grieving mother. "You're right," Eleanor said quietly. "You're not Emily, and it's unfair of me to have put you in that position, even unintentionally." Grace blinked, surprised by the admission. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "When I saw you for the first time, it was like seeing a part of Emily again. I thought it was fate, a way to heal something that's been broken for so long. But I understand now that I can't bring her back. And I don't want to. What I want is to help you become who you're meant to be." Charles reached out and placed a hand over Eleanor's, his support unspoken but evident. "I want to stay," Grace said softly. "Not because of Emily, but because I feel like I belong here. But I need to be here as myself." Eleanor nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "Of course." The tension in the room eased, and for the first time, Grace felt like she could breathe. Over the next few weeks, the dynamics in the Whitmore house began to shift. Eleanor, true to her word, stopped comparing Grace to Emily and instead focused on nurturing her talent. Grace poured herself into her piano lessons, her music taking on a new depth and confidence. Liam became a constant presence, his sharp edges softening as their bond deepened. He was no longer just the enigmatic son of a powerful family. He was someone Grace could trust, someone who challenged and supported her in equal measure. Their late-night conversations by the piano turned into quiet moments of connection, and Grace found herself falling for him in a way that felt as natural as breathing. One evening, during a family gathering in the music room, Grace played a piece she had composed herself. It was a tribute to the life she had lost, the life she had found, and the journey in between. As the final notes faded, the room erupted in applause, and Grace felt a surge of pride and belonging she had never known before. Eleanor approached her after the performance, her smile warm and genuine. "Emily would have loved that," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But more importantly, I loved it. You've given this family something I never thought we'd have again. Hope." Grace smiled, her heart full. "Thank you for giving me the chance to find it, too." The Whitmores weren't perfect, but neither was Grace. Together, they were building something new, something real. And for the first time in her life, Grace felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Secrets of the Heart. This story was a labor of love, filled with twists, emotions, and characters that I hope have touched your heart as much as they did mine. Now, I have a special request for you. If you enjoyed this story, please don't leave without subscribing to our channel and leaving a comment below. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue creating content that inspires, entertains, and connects us all. Leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts about Grace's journey, your favorite moments, or even what you'd like to see in future stories. Subscribe, be the first to know when new stories are released, and join a community that celebrates the magic of storytelling. Your engagement isn't just appreciated, it's essential. Every subscription, every comment, and every like helps our channel grow and allows us to keep bringing stories like this one to life. Together, we can make this space a home for all lovers of romance, drama, and heartfelt tales. Thank you for being part of the story. Until next time.